You know, a lot of times, any discussion of responsibility really boils down to one question, and that is, what is the least amount of responsibility that I can take on and still be a good human? In other words, how can I avoid being at fault or being connected to the suffering of others? What is the least amount of connection I can have? According to philosopher Eric Severson, writer of the book Scandalous Obligation, our instincts drive us to try and find a way out of responsibility. We don't want to get in trouble. So let's say you're sitting next to somebody on a college campus and they start yelling about their roommate's bathroom habits across the quad. You're going to want to distance yourself from being connected to them. Or maybe you have a partner who says something that's deeply unfunny, and for all intents and purposes, you've never met them. Again, we're trying to distance ourselves from any kind of association with the suffering of others. So when we're talking about responsibility, most people's default setting is, how do I avoid fault or avoid blame? How can I be disconnected from the suffering of others? Now, this definition of responsibility, it makes it appear as though responsibility is all about blame and fault and restitution. But as Severson reminds us, responsibility has to do with those that we encounter as strangers, enemies, and others. In this video, we're going to talk about a number of things. First, we're going to talk about the basics of what's going on in Scandalous Obligation, what sort of sources and what thoughts Severson has going on in this section of the book. Next, we're going to jump to the main argument of the text. And in jumping to the main argument, I'm going to try and outline the really big thing that he's trying, that at least I think he is trying to hammer home in this point in the text about responsibility. And then finally, I'm going to set up what our live stream on Friday is going to talk about, specifically the heaps essay. Now, each one of these sections is going to have chapters in the description below, and I'm going to put up title cards so that you'll be able to know what section something is in. So hopefully that will make it a lot more easy for you to navigate through the video. Without further ado, let's get into the first section. So for Severson, the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas is really influential. And for Levinas, and by extension Severson, responsibility is all about hearing and responding to the call to justice from other people. And other people should be understood as strangers, neighbors, enemies, refugees, anyone else. What are others calling to us to do in relation to them? So right off the bat, we don't have a kind of personal ethic that is, how am I as an individual moral, pushing aside all other obligations. Instead, it is, I am in connection to, I am ethical in connection to another human being or many other human beings. Now, what Severson tries to do next is develop what I call a typology of responsibility. Namely, this is a collection of different perspectives of what responsibility means and how we might think about it. And this is a really helpful tool. A lot of philosophers do this. Aristotle does it. A lot of others will do this because it's really helpful for getting an idea of the depth of a particular concept. So Severson begins by talking about the religious take on responsibility. And when we say religious takes, we're mostly talking about the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? These are the three sort of monotheisms of the Western world, although any religious studies scholars or practitioners of those religious traditions are probably going to have a few qualms with that characterization. I'm only using it loosely. Now, these religious takes on responsibility largely define it as an act of complying with divine command, right? Sometimes this ethics is called the divine command theory. God said it, I believe it, I do it, kind of a thing, right? And so any responsibility that humans have is directly connected to their ability to fulfill that command. With responsibility being understood as doing that which receives divine approval, you begin to watch what religious practitioners do and how they live out this responsibility. For example, Christians will get baptized, have potlucks, fight about whether or not it's okay to have swears in your music. Those who practice Judaism will celebrate Hanukkah and the High Holy Days and Purim, God's camping holiday. And Muslims will pray 5 times a day. You get the idea, right? These religious practitioners are practicing or being responsible to the divine command that they've been given. Now, bear in mind, again, this is just from an ethical perspective. I'm not an expert on these religious traditions. I am characterizing this in this way in order to give you an idea of what this type of responsibility looks like. And it provides a structure of responsibility that we can see not just in religious traditions but elsewhere, right? Those who attempt to be responsible in order to get some kind of reward, right? Get some kind of approval, win a trophy, that sort of thing. Be a big, important deal. Now, there's another version or another definition of responsibility that would say responsibility is about fulfilling the tenets of what is required to be a good person. And I say good person because good is understood in a very culturally specific context, right? It is about the appearance of goodness and fulfilling a number of sort of ethical checklists rather than the nuts and bolts of goodness, right? Today we might refer to this as being somebody who virtue signals rather than somebody who actually does the work. Somebody who makes all the right activisty Instagram posts or tells everybody about what issue they've suddenly discovered they're very passionate about for that day/week, right? And then moves on because in their mind, it is about the right belief and signaling to others that you are a person with that right belief. Now, I think it's perfectly fine in a world where people might be afraid that others who disagree with them could cause them physical and emotional harm, to signal to others that you are a person who practices the things that you claim to be virtuous or good or important. I think that's perfectly fine to say, hey, I believe that all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and that means that I think about my decisions on the basis of whether or not it harms people, especially those who are most socially, economically, and politically disadvantaged in the society we live in. That sounds totally fine to me. But there's also a side of it that is about fulfilling a certain identity rather than fulfilling ethical obligations to real human beings in a real physical, material, emotional need. Those are two different things. And it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you might find yourself, adherence to a particular identity as the marker of whether or not you are being responsible is inherently troubling. Because it's not about the actions you do, it's about the things that you believe. When we read about Nietzsche, this is going to really get amped up because Nietzsche is very, very, very unhappy with people who signal that they are good, ethical people and treat other people like garbage. Anyway, the point is that we have these two definitions of responsibility that function in ways that Severson finds to be less than desirable. So, what might be the desirable way to talk about ethics? What might be a more full and all encompassing definition of responsibility that can help us understand what responsibility means when we are interacting with strangers, enemies, and others? Well, that is what we're going to talk about in the next section. So in the next section of Scandalous Obligation, Severson pivots to what he calls a new model of responsibility. Rather than adherence to divine command, rather than fulfilling some sort of checklist about socially acceptable goodness or ethicality, Severson says, I am my responsibility. I am my responsibilities. Who I am, the kind of being that I am, is what it is insofar as it is connected to the people that I have to respond to, whose ethical call calls for me to behave towards them and ultimately towards the world in which we live in a very different way than I would if I completely disregarded them and believed that I was the only being in existence. So, he then jumps into talking about the argument as to why I am my responsibility. Severson begins his argument by making the following claim. Habits of culture and history make us blind to the ways that we reenact the injustices of our ancestors. In other words, we are enculturated, we are socialized, we are taught habits of dealing with other people that reflect both the moral progress and injustices of those who have come before. And so those of us who benefit from certain social structures that were very much the case in the past, and those who are disadvantaged by those past social structures, still have that baked into what we do when we are moving and being and relating to others in the present. The way that we are enculturated and bring this cultural background into what we're doing can blind us to the plight of others. And I think this is especially true in times of intense political polarization. Another person doesn't just disagree with me. They're my enemy. And they are dangerous and they must be destroyed. Because if they are not destroyed, then what they want to have happen will happen, and everything that I love and everyone I care about will be completely destroyed and decimated. So goes the thinking that is enculturated in a way that sees the world as a zero-sum game. But if we looked at responsibility differently, if we engaged with others in a way that treated them as human beings calling out for justice, even if they are our enemy, we might act differently. Now, this isn't to say that therefore you should be completely civil to, like, I don't know, space Nazis, right? We'll call them stormtroopers to avoid getting a bunch of people in YouTube really mad and flooding the comments, right? Doesn't mean that you are a friend of stormtroopers or that you have to be kind to people or you have to be nice to people who think that you are less than human. What it means is that you have to think about other humans as human, as beings with dignity who are calling out for justice. And you can't just write them off as mindless hordes of stormtroopers marching your way to crush you, even though that might be what's happening. Something has happened that has made them to act that way. It's not that it's your responsibility to change their mind, but it's your responsibility to try and treat them as a human. This misunderstanding of the others, dehumanization of them, and making them an enemy, leads to what Severson would probably say is the fundamental quandary of responsibility. On the one hand, the other is beyond my comprehension. I can't fully know them. They are not a being that is reducible down to a set of ideas that or facts that I can know in my head and therefore react to in that way. They are a being that I can't fully understand in that way. That doesn't mean that we can't have a connection to one another. It means that I can't ever nail them down as one type of thing, one type of person. On the other hand, the call to responsibility means that I have to respond to a person that I can't fully understand. I can't fully grasp their needs and meet them in the particular way that they are the other. Which means that responsibility is laden with irresponsibility at every turn. It is entirely possible that in meaning well, I can accidentally be deeply irresponsible. Now, this problem leads to the issue of having to engage in responsible actions that might be at odds with other attempts at responsibility or other beings to whom we need to be responsible. It might be the case that being a responsible employee puts you at odds with being responsible to the plight of unhoused and underfed persons, or to the way that customers of certain identity groups are treated. One of the steps that people take to avoid this threat of irresponsibility in the attempt to be responsible is to severely limit what we think we can be responsible for. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. What is the least amount of responsibility that I can take? Because at least I can maybe get that right and I won't get in trouble. The problem with this is that it's not really responsibility we're talking about. We're talking about blame. We're talking about ourselves. We're not caring about the other person. It's not that limiting our ethical responsibilities is in and of itself bad. It's that these limitations are done to avoid commitment to another person rather than being done as a way of trying and failing and trying again. In other words, the responsibility to continue to try and do justice to the unknowable other is challenged by our idea that we don't want to get in trouble. We don't want to get our hands dirty. We don't want to take responsibility for our failings when we are trying to help. And that leads us to the second part of the attempt to overcome the fundamental tension in being responsible. It's limiting our responsibility to what I intended to do. I did not intend to spill that toxic waste that turned Matt Murdock into Daredevil, right? I did not intend to accidentally let the radioactive spider loose in the lab that bit Peter Parker. Severson is clear that the world is full of broken windows nobody intended to break. So even if our attempt to overcome this tension of irresponsibility is to say, well, I'm only responsible for what I intended to do, the consequences of our actions can have disastrous effects that are our fault, even if we don't intend that to be the case. So how do we address that? So how do we resolve this fundamental tension between the unknowability of the other and this unending call to justice by them, and the perpetual fall into irresponsibility that ensues? How do we resolve it? Well, we don't. For Severson, his answer is more like a journey to undertake or a question that calls for a response than a straightforward, here's how I solve the problem. And this is where we end up with I am my responsibilities. Because I am only I insofar as I am connected to others and respond to them. I am therefore less myself when I am not responding than when I am irresponsible in my relation to other people. Even if I am irresponsible, even if I fail, I am the one who does this, and I bear that. And as a result, I am connected to the other, always trying to do justice to them. Now, this brings us right to the point where we can talk about John Heap's article, Being You. Now, that article is a great way for us to think about identity and responsibility as it relates to the classes that we are in and the intellectual endeavors we're engaged in. And that is sort of the main reason why Heaps wrote this article, is to try and express an invitation for somebody who's taking a class into the work of that class, and to understand that being a student is part of one's identity. For Heaps, what he wants us to think about is how we can be ethical and responsible as students, as thinkers, as people who have questions, right? So that leads me to a kind of concluding thought that I think might be worth mulling over for a bit. Namely, how are we responsible with the ideas we have and the questions we ask? We're going to talk more about the Heaps article in the live stream on Friday, so I look forward to engaging with you in that. In the meantime, why don't you go be some responsible students and do your reading? Adios.